Okay, so today I'd like to welcome Aaron Bhambra, who's studying for his PhD at the University of Birmingham. And Aaron's going to talk to us, this is his second entoLIVE, on the range expansion of the Noble Jewel-wasp. And this was a paper that was published in one of our partners' publications, the British Entomological and Natural History Society's journal, earlier this year. So over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Kieran. So, hi everyone. I'm Aaron, and thank you all for coming out today and listening to a talk about wasps, which a lot of the time get kind of ignored and people don't tend to like them. But I'm a student in the geography department in the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Birmingham, and I've been studying there for the past 3 years. And my research focuses mainly on habitat fragmentation and heathlands, and looking at how the fragmentation impacts bee and wasp assemblages. And I'm really pleased that I'm able to actually be here today to talk about the Noble Jewel-wasp, Hedychrum nobile, because I was at a conference not that long ago. It was a RES conference, and I gave a sort of a watered down version of this talk, and it was because there's a lot of speakers over in a day over a conference. You have to get a lot of people in. You have to really sort of shorten everything down. I couldn't really tell the full story. So today I'm going to tell you the full story of the range expansion of what I think is one of the most interesting species that has come to our country in a long time, a beautiful jewel wasp. So like with all great stories, I'm going to start by talking about science fiction, because in the opening scene of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, if anyone's ever read it, the Martians, they actually land on a heathland in Surrey called Horsell Common. And this has some relevance later on in the talk. But the reason why Wells actually picked a heathland for the arrival of the Martians is because he wanted to pick a really eerie landscape. And anyone who's ever been to sort of heathlands and moorlands, they'll know they're quite eerie, arid, strange, kind of desert-like places. And they're particularly interesting for a range of wildlife taxa. And heathland is actually an internationally rare habitat type. It's actually more threatened than tropical rainforest, which is quite staggering when you think about it. And the landscape of a heathland is characterized by what we call dwarf shrub communities. And these are made of what we call ericaceous plants. So these are heathers, gorses, brooms, things like that. And they thrive in low nutrient acidic soils. And these landscapes, like I said, they support a wide variety of wildlife, but they are particularly interesting for ground nesting invertebrates. So specifically my specialist group, bees and wasps, as well as other things like ground nesting beetles, for example. And many of the species of bee and wasp that we have in Britain actually nest in sand. And the bare earth of a heathland landscape is perfect for these nesting chambers to be created. So heathland, heathland is it's an internationally threatened habitat type, and it's particularly rare. And Britain actually supports an estimated a quarter of the world's population of lowland heath. And this habitat type supports species across several taxa, and they're species that are very specialized to living in arid, xeric-like conditions, so desert-like conditions. And they have really interesting drought tolerances, for example. And bees and wasps are really well adapted to living in these landscapes. And this is because of the large availability of nesting habitat and the form of sand available throughout these habitats. So in that small clip in the middle there, you can see sand that's being excavated from heathlands. And the surrounding images just show the different pictures from heathlands across the West Midlands, which show lots of heather, lots of dwarf shrubs, but also a lot of bare earth, sandy habitat that makes up these areas. So burrowing to sand is a really effective strategy to ensure survival of the larvae of many species of bee and wasp. And many insects actually seek out sands to nest, and we call these samophiles. And underground temperatures, they're much less volatile than on the surface. And this enables larvae to develop at a much steadier rate. So it's that volatility, it's the change in temperature that can often harm the development of a larvae. They need balance, and they need a steady developmental rate. And living underground may also provide protection from predation by brood parasites, and the lack of moisture that's often found in substrates like sand may actually lead to increased survival rates, because there's less chances of infection from mites and other types of harmful bacteria that develop in moist areas. And that's often actually why in areas like South America, well, in really humid areas like tropical rainforest, you actually don't get the same kind of levels of species diversity as you would imagine with these really highly species-rich areas. And it's because the humidity can actually lead to pollen getting spoiled really easily and mites developing, which harm the larvae. So nesting burrows, generally, they consist of a single main tunnel, which goes underground, and that can actually extend up to a meter underground. There's some studies in America where they've looked at how far the nesting chambers actually go within the soil, and it's quite remarkable. But at the end of each of these main branches is a lateral branch, and at the end of each of the lateral branches is a nesting chamber. And inside that nesting chamber, if you're a wasp, you will have an animal, so you'll have another insect. If you're a bee, you'll just have pollen. You'll have vegetative material, and you'll have a single egg and single cell. So, because of where bees and wasps nest, to catch them, you have to sweep your net across the floor, and it often looks really weird. People think that you look very strange. And this is me doing some sweep netting in a site in Worcestershire called Hartlebury Common. And during June of 2022, I was doing this all over the West Midlands. I was sweep netting sandy paths, looking for bees and wasps. It's a really common sampling method for collecting ground nesting species. And on one of the days when I was walking through a site called Sutton Park in Birmingham, I came across a bright metallic jewel-wasp. And that June, it was one of the hottest on record in a month where there had been weeks of just uninterrupted hot, dry weather. And because I found this really interesting jewel-wasp, which looked very different to other jewel-wasps that I'd seen, say on bee hotels or just out sampling, I decided that I'd head to a few other sites that were nearby, make use of the really good weather, and see if I could find any more of these individuals. And I was quite astonished to find that I found 60 individual specimens of this new wasp at 7 sites scattered across South Staffordshire, North Worcestershire, Birmingham, and Walsall, which is a borough of the Black Country. And the specimens of the wasp were collected from different sites, and they were examined by several Aculeate taxonomists. And they determined the specimens to be Hedychrum nobile, a species of wasp which prior to 1998 had never actually been recorded before in Britain, but had just quite suddenly turned up in the West Midlands in 2022. So some of the this image here is a depiction of the areas where the species was found within the boroughs of the West Midlands, and it's overlain over a geological map showing that the areas of sandstone. So what you can see here is the boroughs of the West Midlands Combined Authority, so Birmingham, Sandwell, Wolverhampton, Birmingham, and Walsall. And up here you've got Cannock Chase and South Staffordshire. This is the borough of Walsall. And what the purple patches show where remnants of Heathland are found, and the purple dots show where there's a reference to Heathland in the past name. So you can see that the whole area of Birmingham, the Black Country, is full of lowland heath, and it's the same in Staffordshire. It's the same in Worcestershire. This whole area grew up over a landscape of heathland, and because of this, there's all of these sites of sandy habitat that have been sort of left. They used to be used for mining, that have been left to develop into sort of nature reserves that provide these stepping stones for species such as Hedychrum nobile to move through areas as stepping stones throughout the landscape. And this was hypothesized that this could be what was happening with Hedychrum nobile, this new species that had turned up in the West Midlands. So Hedychrum nobile, a little bit of backstory for it. This species was first recorded in Britain by the late David Baldock in July of 1998 at none other than Horsell Common in Surrey, where the Martians landed. His first reaction was to determine the species to be Hedychrum nyamale, a very similar species of Hedychrum wasp, which we've had in Britain for over a century. However, he was starting to find lots of these individual wasps turning up throughout his area of Surrey, and they all came about quite suddenly. And so he looked a little bit more closely at the genitalia of multiple specimens from across southeast England, and he used really interesting European keys that had a much larger fauna than our own British keys. And by looking at these European keys, he was able to identify the species as Hedychrum nobile, which is actually a new species to Britain. And this is David Baldock here on the left. He is quite an amazing character in the bees and wasps world, because he came. I never knew him or met him myself, but he came quite late to the love of bees and wasps, and I think he was a banker in a former life, but he had only been studying them for a few years before he started to make national contributions, such as finding Hedychrum nobile, and then he went off to Portugal and did some helped Portuguese researchers sample their bees before his untimely death. But yeah, really interesting. I've made a really interesting contribution to our understanding of this species in Britain. And David sought help from his friend and fellow entomologist, Roger Hawkins. And Roger's also a really interesting guy. He's an entomologist who I met at a British Entomological and Natural History Society AGM meeting. And Roger spoke German, and he was able to read these European keys and run the specimens of Hedychrum nobile through the keys to check them. And funnily enough, actually, the specimens of Hedychrum nobile that were for my paper, Roger actually checked them, and he collected them from the British Entomological and Natural History Society event. So it's quite interesting. But what was really interesting about their story is that they both checked historic specimens identified under the name Hedychrum nyamale, so the other species that was quite similar. And what they found was that many of these Hedychrum nyamale were actually errors. They had been misidentified. Their findings actually proved that the species Hedychrum nobile had actually been in Britain since 1998, but just misidentified under a different species name. And what was cool is that between 2001 and 2009, while all this research was going on, this wasp began rapidly spreading westwards from Kent, developing a stronghold around London. And here she is. So Hedychrum nobile, she's a late-flying univoltine jewel wasp. So univoltine means one generation a year, and it's associated with dry, sunny, open habitats. In Britain, their emergence is between June and September, and generally sexes vary between about 6 and 10 millimeters in length. And this is just the general rule of thumb across all bees and wasps. Females tend to be larger than males. There's quite a significant variety in the sizes of individuals, however, even within the same sites, within the same counties. And this can make things very confusing when you try to identify them. And that's just because insects will vary depending on size, dependent on the resources available to them, just in the same way that humans will. But what's interesting about Hedychrum nobile is this wasp is a brood parasite in the Chrysalidae. So it's a kleptoparasite that will attack the larvae of a host, and it's found throughout Europe, Asia, and North Africa. So here's a little bit of hardcore entomology for anyone who's really into that kind of thing. The diagnostic taxonomic features that you need to identify Hedychrum nobile to species level include 3 really key ones, really. So the first one is the lateral teeth on the abdomen. So any member of any wasp that has these lateral teeth right on the last tergite of the abdomen is a member of the Chrysalidae. You know, it's a jewel wasp. It's a brood parasite. It will attack the larvae of a host. And according to Paul Kuhnen, he's a Finnish entomologist who updated the keys of the Chrysalidae for Europe, basically. What Paul Kuhnen said is that members of the genus Hedychrum, they possess a bifid tarsal claw. So you need a really good microscope or a really good camera or a decent microscope to see this feature, but it's literally a bifid tarsal claw, so 2 features on the claw. Members of the species nobile have on the mesotibia, so it's the middle tibia, they have a shallow oval depression. And with those 3 characters, you could actually get your individual down to species. But if you're really, really into this stuff and you want to extract the genitalia, like some people love to do, then what you can do is you gently tease out the genitalia when the specimen is still fresh. And what you're looking for in a male is that the discus is longer than the cuspis. So you're looking at these 2 features, and if one is longer than the other, then you know that you've got one species over another. Generally, it's difficult to identify this species because people tend not to have a lot of experience with taxonomic keys and have a reference collection. But actually, if you get your eye in for some of these features, it's actually not too bad. And anyone who's used to identifying bees and wasps, they could do this individual. There's also really good keys online that you can use, like the key to the Chrysalidae of the Nordic and Baltic countries. Oh, okay, so Hedychrum nobile is a brood parasite, and it attacks the larvae of fabronid wasps in the family Philanthinae. So these are digger wasps, and in this particular case, it attacks a digger wasp in the genus Cerceris. So as cuckoos, they'll seek out the nesting cell of a specific host before entering into their underground chamber to lay an egg hidden within the cell wall. The hatching parasitoid larva will subsequently destroy the mature larva of its host. And Hedychrum nobile is known to attack the sandstone digger wasp Cerceris arenaria, which is figure A, this wasp here. And this wasp is a predator of this weevil, usually vine weevils. But what's also interesting is that these images were taken by a student called Bailey Carswell Morris, who's a really fantastic photographer and a young entomologist. And all of these images were taken from specimens collected through field work, and we've kind of tried to tell the story of the life history of these insects through the images that we're showing, as you'll see as we go through. But what was interesting is that Cerceris ribaensis is this wasp here, this wasp, which is figure C. This wasp is not traditionally associated with Hedychrum nobile, but it was found during our research, but I'll come on to that a bit more later. So let's look a little bit more closely at the morphology. So in males of nobile, the head, scutum, scutellum, median segment, basically the whole of the thorax, they're a brilliant metallic blue, while the abdomen can be gold or red, and it kind of depends on how the light reflects off the individual. Generally, males emerge earlier than females, and it's usually the first weeks of June in most districts, but it varies. And it's partly caused by local weather conditions as well. But they've just got super cool antennae, and you can even see the bifid claw on the legs. And in the female, they're, in my opinion, a little bit more pretty. The thorax is a beautiful bright red. They've got green and bluey head. It's a little bit more turquoise, if you like. And the abdomen grades between red and gold, and the same as the males. And the females are often actually found in nest sites in and around sandy areas, whereas the males are often found like nectaring on tansy and umbellifers and things like that. And remember, jewel wasps are heavily armored to carry out their brood parasitism. I mean, they are brood parasites. They have to sneak into a nest of a bee or a wasp, but in this case, a wasp, a very, very scary digger wasp, and hide their egg. And sometimes the wasps are in there, or sometimes they get found. The wasp tries to sting them, but these brood parasites are really well armored, and you can just see how evolution over time has selectively pressured these insects into having this amazing armoring with this amazing sculpturing all over the thorax. So Cerceris arenaria, it attacks this weevil. It generally tends to be vine weevils, and it actually captures the adult specimens and it carries them, flies with them. So it's so cool when you watch these things when they're flying, because you just see these like things moving across the sky, and you think you've got a new insect to science, but it's not. It's just like a wasp carrying a weevil. But Cerceris ribaensis, it's a digger wasp which hunts adult solitary bees. So it's actually quite different to Cerceris arenaria. This species will hunt solitary bees, usually mining bees like Andrena and Laserglossum. And they're quite scarce. Sorry, they're common across southern Britain, and they become even more common into central England, the West Midlands, whereas Cerceris arenaria, this wasp, is actually really common in southern England, but becomes much scarcer as you come into the West Midlands. Weirdly, both wasps seem to be relatively absent from Wales, and I have some distribution maps that I can show you. So the first one, this map indicates the current and historic distribution of Hedychrum nobile in Britain. So as part of our research, we updated the records. We went into the BWARS database. We got all of the records, and we in here you can see the darker the circle, the older the record, the lighter the circle, the newer the record. And the records in the center there show the records that were picked up during field work for our research. And so you can see that there's been around 184 records of this wasp submitted to the recording scheme since its arrival in 1998. It has a southerly and southeasterly distribution, moving into central and eastern England. And during the summer drought of 2022, the species made its way into the West Midlands, and it's since moved further into the north and into the East Midlands, into Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. And it's actually travelled at a rate of 10 kilometres a year since its arrival. But have the and the distribution of Hedychrum nobile largely mirrors that of its host, Cerceris arenaria. So in this map, what you can see is the Hedychrum nobile in red, overlaid by the records of Cerceris arenaria, which we updated for BWARS. So as an obligate brood parasite, this wasp can only be found, it's going to be confined to areas where its host is. So really, when you're looking at the distribution of Hedychrum nobile, in a way, you're looking at the distribution of Cerceris arenaria, or are you? And this is what's quite interesting. We've only been doing this for a few years. We don't have enough data to really see a good pattern of what's happening. But it's interesting that Hedychrum nobile is found in areas where Cerceris arenaria isn't, and vice versa. So what might be happening there? And have range, and clearly Hedychrum nobile is having a range expansion, but have range expansions been seen in other insects? So the harlequin ladybird is a really good example of this, but range shifts in invertebrates have been documented in numerous species since the early 2000s. So there was a study that was done at the University of York, and they analysed over 25 million records from around 300 invertebrate taxa. And I don't think I provided Kieran with a link for this, so I'll provide it after. But what they actually found was that generalist species and generalist species are generally moving northwards quite quickly in comparison to specialist species, which seem to be contracting. And they provided some really interesting examples of this. So the first is the migrant hawker, which is a dragonfly. And they recorded that it's been increasing its range by 17 to 28 meters per day over a 40-year period, which is quite astonishing when you think about it. And the harlequin ladybird, this is one of the most fascinating of all the stories because it's an invasive species that has had a seriously negative impact on our native ladybirds. But it's also amazing in the sense of how quickly it's been able to move through Britain and how thoroughly it's colonized our island. So it's an invasive colonist from Asia. It arrived in 2004, and since then it's colonized all of England, and it's moving through Scotland, and it's traveling around 100 kilometers a year over the first 4 years of its journey. So it's quite amazing. But what about bees and wasps? Have they been moving north? Well, range expansions in bees and wasps are becoming more common within Britain. So there's a good example of this is the European bee wolf, which is Philanthus triangulum. It's once a rare species confined to southeast England, sort of areas around Essex, and I'm talking sort of like the 1830s. And since then, it's had enormous range expansion. And in recent years, it's colonized areas of the West Midlands, and it's found as far north as Staffordshire and probably further north than that. According to Bee Wars, there have been around 3,000 records for this species, and since 1830, with 2,000 of those records occurring in the last 20 years. And what's really interesting is that since Met Office monitoring began in Britain in 1830, the 10 hottest years in British history have all occurred in the last 20 years. So there could be a link here between the fact that we've had these enormously hot, dry periods, years over the last 20 years, and a huge increase in the number of records. One thing we have to be wary of, though, is that biological recording has improved over the last 20 years, partly due to things like this and other projects that have been set up by BioLinks, for example, encouraging people to record, but also because of national recording schemes like the Earthworm recording scheme or the Hoverfly recording scheme or Bee Wars. And that means that we're getting more and more data. But it is interesting that temperature could be affecting range expansions in insects. So how might it do that in bees and wasps? Well, bees and wasps are reliant on warmth for both their larval development and as adults for locomotion. As larvae, wasps require steady, sustained temperatures over long periods of time. So the ground nesting ecology of Hedychrum nobile may have actually protected that species and enabled it to tolerate milder winters. But also hotter seasonal temperatures may also encourage faster larval development, resulting in multivoltinism in species which have traditionally been univoltile. So differences in voltinism due to temperature gradients are known to exist within Britain already. So you'll get species that in the southern half of their range, they have 2 generations a year, but in the northern, they'll have 1. And that's all because of local climate. However, currently there's no evidence to actually suggest that this is happening with Hedychrum nobile, in Britain at least. So the other thing is as adults, bees and wasps require periods of dry, sunny weather to fly and collect food. Cold periods or spells of wet, windy weather can impact the distance that a pollinator can fly or a wasp can fly and travel. And prolonged periods of hot weather may facilitate the dispersal of these wasps, enabling them to roam over larger distances and colonize new areas. So the increased time that is allowed by better weather gives these wasps a greater opportunity and a greater chance to move through the landscape. And this may enable those species to expand their range into fresh habitat more quickly. And extreme weather events in the form of drought may also support the dispersal of this species in Britain. So every record of the wasp that was found in the West Midlands in 2022 was observed from from my research, from a sandy footpath. Sandy paths provide excellent temporary habitat for a number of ground nesting species, and they benefit from nesting in the structural compaction created by human footfall. Also, the footfall keeps vegetation from growing over the areas and keeps it bare. And moisture actually reduces the structural integrity of these nesting chambers. So it could be that intermittent rainfall may impact the nesting habits of Hedychrum nobile, and that drought may actually increase its chances by leading to more dry path habitat being available for them to colonize during these periods of hot, dry weather. And the summer of 2022 was the fifth worst drought in British history, and it was one of the worst European droughts in about 500 years. This same period aligned with the influx of 60 records of Hedychrum nobile in the West Mids. The lack of rainfall during June and July of 2022 may have benefited this species by ensuring that there was suitable habitat for it to move into. So extreme weather events in the form of drought may have facilitated the dispersal of this species. And Hedychrum nobile may be a species which benefits from both gradual climate warming in terms of its larval development, as well as these extreme weather events in terms of its adult dispersal. And you may recall this slide where I talked about Cerceris ribaensis. So this wasp is not usually associated with Hedychrum nobile, but it was recorded during fieldwork, during observations. We actually watched Hedychrum nobile go into burrows of this wasp and would stay there for a little while, then it would pop out, and it could have been parasitizing the eggs inside. We don't know. But it's a possibility, and this would be quite interesting if it were the case, because it may help explain why Hedychrum nobile has done so well in expanding its range throughout Britain, because it could have potentially turned to a new host. And in southeast England, entomologists routinely record Hedychrum nobile entering and leaving the burrows of Cerceris ribaensis, but there would need to be proof of this scientifically in order for us to say this absolutely. And in order for us to get that proof, we would probably have to go into a Cerceris ribaensis nest and rear out one of its offspring to see if we get a Hedychrum nobile larvae. And if we do, then we can prove definitively that there's been a relationship between these two species. And what's even more interesting about this is that Cerceris arenaria, the sandstone digger wasp, hunts weevils, and the Cerceris ribaensis hunts solitary bees. And the Hedychrum nobile will, as a larva, it will feed on whatever the food has been provided by the wasp that it's hunting. So that would actually mean that the Hedychrum nobile wasp has moved from eating weevils to eating solitary bees and wasps. I guess a protein is protein, but could it be that temperature is acting as a pressure that's forcing these insects to adapt to new conditions? So looking ahead into the future, what can we expect as the climate continues to warm? If we look at 7 northern European countries, we can find at least 90 documented species that have experienced a range expansion since 1990. And some of these species have come, they're cavity nesters, and they've come from timber. They've been exported, like the giant resin bee. But many species are actually like ground nesting species, which have historically moved from Mediterranean climate into our areas. And they are ground nesting. It's a natural colonization, and they may be moving into Northern Europe as the climatic conditions here become more suitable to them over time, and the climatic conditions where they are become unsuitable. And so this map from the European Atlas of Bees shows the species richness is greatest in the hottest parts of the Western Palearctic. So you can see Iberia, Africa, the area around the Mediterranean basin. These are the hottest areas, and these are the areas with the greatest richness. And many of the range expanding species, like I said, are coming in cavities. So they're coming from imported timber. This is Megacole sculpturalis. This is the giant resin bee. It came to France in timber, and it's now, I think it's colonized a third of France, which is pretty remarkable. But many of the other species are actually species that are associated to hot, arid landscapes around the Mediterranean, and these tend to be fossorial species. So just talking about some of those species that have moved north, across in different countries, many of these species have colonized countries for the first time through their range expansion, and because of that, they've been picked up. So France has had 7 new colonists since 1990, Luxembourg 12, Germany 24, Switzerland 35, the Netherlands 19, Belgium has had 23, and 12 of those have come since 2017. So we can use online data to actually build a picture about how species are moving, not just in Britain, but across the world. But where are these species migrating from? Well, before we discuss that, I just want to touch very briefly on a bit of bee evolution. So bees originated 120 million years ago. There's about 20,000 species worldwide in 7 families, and they likely originated in the early Cretaceous, shortly before the breakup of a continent called Gondwana. So that it would have been Western Gondwana, which is now Africa and South America. So they would have been associated with a African or South American landmass. So they would have come from a hot, sandy, dry, desert-like area, and they would have proliferated from these areas out into Northern Europe through dispersal and vicariance, which is stages of speciation. But the habitats where bees evolve from are hot, dry, and they're a lot like Heathlands in many respects. And this is just from some of the research that they did looking at this. So if you look at the distribution of bees across the Western Palearctic, species richness is greatest in the countries with the lowest latitudes and with the hottest climates. And it's possible that many of these species are moving northwards into Europe, and they're traveling from those hotter areas. And as the climate of Europe warms, species which were once confined to countries with narrow temperature ranges are now able to expand. And this could be what has been happening with Hedychrum nobile. Yeah, so we are already experiencing the arrival of some of these species in the form of Hedychrum nobile, but then there's others. So this species is Hedychrum rutilans, the ground nesting brood parasite of the bee wolf, Phyllanthus triangulum. There's only ever been one known specimen in Britain, and it was caught in 1899 by a lady called Hannah Chawner, who was an amateur entomologist, and she studied sawflies, and she found this wasp on a piece of rustic woodwork in her garden. She gave it to her friend, who's a guy called Edward Maurice, who is like a he's a very famous entomologist. He's a European expert, real top entomologist, and he identified the species as Hedychrum rutilans, the first ever species, and this lady got it in her garden, which is pretty amazing. But it went extinct in the 20th century. This beautiful red and green jewel-wasp appear, but recently it's been recorded in Essex in 2019 and in 2020, and it's as our climate continues to warm, we can expect to see more of these species moving into our area. So just before I finish, I just want to talk a little bit about recording. If you want to get out and see these wasps, you want to head out between June and September in Britain. You want to look for sandy brownfield sites. Heathlands tend to be the best, but sand dune systems are also really good. You want hard, compacted sandy footpaths, and you're looking really for the burrows of the sandstone digger wasps. They're about 1 centimetre in diameter, and they're a good place to find the females. Males can actually be found nesting or feeding on tansy and wildflowers. So in where I am in the West Midlands, in the hottest parts of June and July, these are the most common wasps on these sites, so they can be quite easily found. And when you've found a wasp, like I said, these species are quite difficult to record, but if you are interested in recording, there's information about how to submit records on the Bee Wars website. But you can also use good quality photos in some instances, but you have to get features like the back of the tibia, the back of the mesotibia. I remember the who, what, where, when. This information is valid for any biological record. But if you think you have a specimen of Hedychrum nobile, and you aren't sure, you can actually get in touch with Bee Wars, and they will help you find your local ECOLOGY taxonomist. And I've sent specimens off in the post many a time, and often people are really happy to identify them for you, and then you'll have a really awesome record. So that's it from me. If you have any questions, please put your hand up.